The storm that swept across the White Mountains that night was one of the most severe winter weather events of the decade. The National Weather Service issued blizzard warnings across northern New Hampshire, with snowfall totals exceeding 30 inches in some areas, and wind gusts recorded at over 80 miles per hour on Mount Washington summit. Temperatures fell to 15 below zero at lower elevations and 50 below at the peaks. It was the kind of weather that could kill an unprepared person in minutes and a prepared person in hours. David Torres didn't sleep. He sat on the couch with his laptop open, refreshing weather forecasts, checking trail condition reports, scrolling through Marcus's social media hoping for some sign that his friend was okay. He texted Marcus every hour, even though the messages showed as undelivered. At 3 a.m., he gave up on sleep entirely and made coffee, standing at the kitchen window watching snow fall on the streets of Cambridge and wondering if Marcus was cold, if he was scared, if he was still alive. The rational part of David's mind knew that Marcus was probably fine. He'd been in worse storms than this. He carried enough gear to survive multiple nights out if necessary. He had shelter, food, water purification, fire-starting equipment, emergency bivy sack, down sleeping bag rated to -20 degrees. He knew how to dig a snow cave, how to recognize the early signs of hypothermia, how to self-arrest if he slipped on ice. If anyone could survive an unexpected night out in winter conditions, it was Marcus Chen. But the irrational part, the part that whispered in the silence of 4 a.m., asked different questions. What if he'd fallen? What if he'd hit his head? What if something had happened that all his experience and equipment couldn't protect him from? What if, right now, he was lying injured in the snow, slowly freezing, waiting for help that wouldn't come until morning? David called the New Hampshire Fish and Game emergency line again at 6 a.m. The dispatcher assured him that a team would be heading to the trailhead at first light to check Marcus's car and assess the situation. First light in January in New Hampshire comes late, around 7:15 a.m. David counted the minutes. At Pinkham Notch, the headquarters of the Appalachian Mountain Club's White Mountains operations, the overnight caretaker had received the missing hiker report around midnight. Brad Morrison, a veteran of 30 years with AMC and countless search operations, knew the Presidential Range better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. When he saw the report, experienced solo hiker, winter conditions, failure to return, GPS last known position unclear, his instincts told him this wasn't a case of someone just running late. The storm had been too severe, the timing too long. Something was wrong. Morrison assembled a preliminary team before dawn. 2 AMC staff members, 3 volunteers from the Androscoggin Valley Search and Rescue Team, and a New Hampshire Fish and Game Conservation Officer. They met at the Appalachia Trailhead at 7:30 a.m., just as gray morning light began filtering through the heavy clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Snow blanketed everything in smooth white curves, covering the parking lot, the trails, the information kiosk. The world was silent except for the occasional crack of ice-laden branches breaking under their own weight. Marcus's blue Subaru was easy to spot. It was the only vehicle in the lot, buried under nearly 2 feet of snow. Conservation Officer Sarah Kemper approached it carefully, brushing snow from the windows and peering inside. The interior was empty except for a gym bag on the back seat and a coffee cup in the holder. No signs of struggle, no indication that Marcus had returned. She radioed to Morrison. Vehicle confirmed. No signs of occupant return, proceeding with trail search. The team split into 2 groups. Morrison led 3 people up Valley Way, following what they hoped was Marcus's intended route toward Madison Hut. The second team, led by Kemper, went up Airline Trail, a parallel path that also accessed the hut from a different angle. Both teams carried avalanche transceivers, probes, shovels, first aid equipment, and enough gear to survive if they got caught out themselves. The snow was deep and the going was slow. Above tree line, the wind was still gusting to 40 miles per hour, and visibility dropped to near zero whenever the wind picked up loose snow and flung it sideways across the exposed slopes. They didn't find Marcus on Valley Way. They didn't find tracks, didn't find gear, didn't find any sign that anyone had passed this way in the last 18 hours. The storm had erased everything. At Madison Hut, a stone shelter perched at 4,800 feet that served as an emergency refuge in winter, they found the building locked and undisturbed. Marcus hadn't made it this far. Kemper's team on Airline Trail reported the same. Nothing. No tracks, no equipment, no trace. It was as if Marcus Chen had simply evaporated somewhere between the trailhead and the hut. At 11 a.m., both teams regrouped at the parking lot. Morrison spread a topographic map across the hood of his truck and marked Marcus's last known GPS position, the coordinates that had been recorded at 11:05 a.m. the previous day. He stared at the spot, his weathered face creased with confusion. "This doesn't make sense," he said to Kemper. "This location is nowhere near his planned route. It's not near any trail. There's nothing out there except old-growth forest and—" He stopped, his finger hovering over the map. "Wait, I know this spot. There's an old fire tower there. CCC built, abandoned since the 60s. I haven't been out there in probably 15 years. Kemper leaned over the map. Why would he go there? That's not on any route to Madison. He wouldn't, not intentionally. That area isn't even marked on hiking maps anymore. Then the GPS data is wrong. Morrison shook his head slowly. Maybe, or maybe something happened that pushed him off course. Disorientation, medical emergency, equipment failure. We need to check that location. But reaching the fire tower wasn't simple. There was no trail. The forest in that area was dense spruce with thick undergrowth, steep slopes, and numerous cliffs and ravines hidden under the snow. A team of rescuers trying to navigate through it in current conditions would be moving at perhaps half a mile per hour, fighting through chest-deep drifts and deadfall. It would take hours to reach the location, and by then it would be getting dark again. Morrison made the call. "We go at first light tomorrow. Tonight, we mobilize a full team. More people, maybe get a helicopter if the weather clears. If he's out there, he's been out for over 24 hours now. Time is critical, but we can't help him if we get lost or injured ourselves." That evening, the search operation officially escalated. The New Hampshire Fish and Game Department issued a press release. Missing hiker in Presidential Range. Marcus Chen, 34, of Cambridge, Massachusetts, failed to return from solo winter hike on Mount Madison. Last known position approximately 3,600 feet elevation, off trail location. Search teams deployed. Anyone with information, please contact NHFG immediately. The story hit local news that night. A few outlets picked it up regionally. Marcus's photo, a smiling headshot from his work badge, appeared on screens across New England, alongside footage of snow-covered mountains and interviews with search coordinators discussing the challenges of winter rescue operations. David Torres watched the news from Marcus's apartment. He'd driven up to New Hampshire that afternoon, unable to stay in Cambridge doing nothing. He'd checked into a motel in Gorham, just 15 minutes from the trailhead, and spent the evening coordinating with Marcus's family. His parents were flying in from Seattle the next morning, and answering questions from investigators about Marcus's experience level, medical history, state of mind, anything that might help explain what had happened. Was he depressed? One investigator asked. Any indication he might have wanted to harm himself? David answered firmly. No, absolutely not. Marcus loved these mountains. He was careful, methodical. This was supposed to be a training hike for a trip to Denali next summer. He was looking forward to things, he had plans. But even as David said it, a small doubt crept into his mind. Had Marcus seemed different lately? Had there been signs David missed? He thought back to their last conversation, replaying it in his head. Marcus had been calm, maybe even happy. No indication that anything was wrong. But then again, Marcus was always calm. It was one of his defining characteristics. He didn't show stress even when he was drowning in it. Could something have been happening beneath that composed surface? David pushed the thought away. Marcus was out there somewhere, probably injured, maybe sheltering from the storm, waiting for rescue. That was the only scenario that made sense. Anything else was unthinkable. Up in the White Mountains, night fell again. The temperature dropped back toward 0. The wind picked up, howling through the spruce forests and across the exposed ridges. And somewhere in that vast wilderness, in a tower that no one knew he'd reached, Marcus Chen stood in the darkness. Standing, waiting. Already dead, but not yet fallen. Already frozen, but not yet found. It would be 4 months before anyone discovered him. 4 months of winter giving way to spring, of snow melting and ice thawing, of search teams combing the mountains and finding nothing, of his family's hope slowly transforming into grief, of questions multiplying with no answers in sight. 4 months before a pair of hikers would stumble upon that forgotten tower, would try the door and find it locked, would peer through a crack in the weathered boards and see something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But on that second night, none of that had happened yet. On that second night, Marcus Chen was still just missing. Still just a search operation in progress. Still just a man who hadn't come home from a hike. On that second night, David Torres sat in a motel room in Gorham, staring at his phone, willing it to ring with good news. It never did. The search for Marcus Chen began in earnest on January 9th, 48 hours after he disappeared. By then, the story had spread beyond New Hampshire. Boston news stations sent reporters to the White Mountains. National outdoor magazines picked up the story. Experienced mountaineer missing in presidential range. Marcus's photo circulated on hiking forums, Facebook groups, Instagram accounts dedicated to White Mountains trail conditions. People who had never met him felt invested in his story. The outdoor community, always tight-knit, always protective of its own, rallied with offers of help. Brad Morrison coordinated the operation from a makeshift command post at Appalachia Trailhead. Tables covered with topographic maps, laptops tracking GPS positions of search teams, radios crackling with periodic check-ins. The temperature that morning was 8 degrees Fahrenheit, clear skies, light wind. The best search conditions they'd had since Marcus disappeared. Morrison had assembled a force of 35 people, Fish and Game officers, AMC staff, volunteers from multiple SAR organizations, a New Hampshire Army National Guard helicopter team on standby. The plan was methodical. Teams would conduct grid searches of the most likely areas, the trails Marcus had intended to hike, the terrain immediately surrounding his last GPS position, and the dense forest sector between Valley Way and the old fire tower coordinates. K-9 units would work the lower elevations where scent might still be detectable despite the snowfall. The helicopter would conduct aerial sweeps of above tree-line areas and any clearings where a bright orange jacket might be visible from the air. Marcus's parents arrived that morning. Robert and Lynn Chen were both in their late 60s. still sharp-minded and composed despite the circumstances. They met with Morrison and the Fish and Game Incident Commander, providing additional details about their son that might aid the search. Medical conditions? None. Medications? None. Recent stress or personal problems? Nothing they were aware of. Marcus had called them 4 days before the hike, his usual weekly check-in. He'd sounded fine, normal. He'd mentioned the upcoming trip, talked about work, asked about their health. There had been no indication that anything was wrong. "He's been hiking these mountains for years," Robert Chen said, his voice steady but his hands betraying him, trembling slightly as he pointed to features on the map. "He knows to turn around if conditions get bad. He knows not to push for a summit in a storm. Whatever happened to him wasn't because he made a reckless decision." Morrison nodded. He'd seen this before. Families struggling to reconcile the person they knew with the fact of disappearance. People didn't just vanish. There was always a reason, always a chain of events, but sometimes that reason was simply bad luck. A momentary lapse, a patch of ice in the wrong place, a branch breaking under your weight. The mountains were beautiful, and the mountains were indifferent. They didn't care about experience or preparation or how careful you'd been 100 times before. The first search team to reach the fire tower location was a group of 4, led by Jake Sullivan, a fish and game conservation officer with 15 years of winter search experience. They'd left the trailhead at 6 a.m. and spent 3 hours navigating through trackless forest, using GPS coordinates to guide them toward the spot where Marcus's watch had stopped transmitting. The terrain was brutal. Steep slopes, thick spruce branches hung low with snow, hidden gaps between boulders that could swallow a leg up to the hip. They moved slowly, methodically, calling Marcus's name every few minutes and stopping to listen for any response. At 9:17 a.m., Sullivan's GPS showed they were within 100 yards of the target coordinates. The forest was so dense here that visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. Snow clung to everything, muffling sound, creating a strange, oppressive silence. Sullivan called a halt and had his team spread out in a line, moving forward together, searching visually for any sign of the fire tower. They almost walked past it. The structure was so covered in snow and ice, so overgrown with decades of forest encroachment, that it blended almost perfectly into the surrounding woods. It was only when Sarah Yates, one of the searchers, noticed the unnatural straightness of a vertical line among the organic chaos of tree trunks that they realized what they were looking at. The tower stood about 30 feet tall, a wooden frame structure with an enclosed cabin at the top, accessed by a ladder of horizontal beams built into one corner of the frame. The cabin itself was roughly 10 feet square, with windows on all 4 sides, most of them now broken or missing entirely, and a peaked roof partially collapsed on one side. The whole structure leaned slightly to the east, as if decades of prevailing winds had gradually pushed it off true vertical. Moss and lichen covered the exposed wood. Small trees had grown up between the support beams at ground level, and the door was chained shut. Sullivan approached carefully, examining the entrance to the cabin at the top of the ladder. A heavy steel chain was looped through the door handle and around one of the support beams, secured with a rusted padlock. The chain itself was old but intact. The padlock was weathered but still functional. There were no fresh marks in the rust, no indication that anyone had tampered with it recently. "Marcus," Sullivan called up toward the cabin. "Marcus Chen, if you can hear me, make a noise." Silence, only wind moving through the spruce branches. Sullivan turned to his team. "I need to get this door open. Yates, radio back to Morrison. Tell him we found the tower and we're investigating. Tell him it's locked from the outside." While Yates made the call, Sullivan examined the chain more closely. The padlock was a standard master lock, probably placed here by the Forest Service years ago when they'd decommissioned the tower. He didn't have bolt cutters. The team hadn't expected to encounter a locked structure in the middle of the wilderness, but he did have a multi-tool with a hacksaw blade. It would take a while, but he could cut through one of the chain links. As he worked, sawing methodically at the hardened steel, his mind was already trying to make sense of what they'd found. If the door was locked from outside, then Marcus couldn't be in the cabin, unless he'd been inside when someone else locked it, but that scenario made no sense. Who would lock someone inside a fire tower in winter? And why was Marcus's GPS showing this location if he'd never actually been here? It took 20 minutes to cut through the chain link. When it finally separated with a sharp ping, Sullivan pulled the chain free and pushed the door open. It resisted at first, swollen wood catching on the frame, but then swung inward with a groan of old hinges. The smell hit him first. It wasn't strong. The cold had prevented most decomposition, but it was unmistakable. The smell of death. Faint, but definitely present. Sullivan pulled a flashlight from his belt and aimed it into the cabin interior. For a moment, his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. His light swept across the small space, past empty shelves, a broken chair, shattered glass on the floor, and then nothing. The cabin was empty. No body, no Marcus Chen, no sign that anyone had been here in years. Sullivan stepped inside, confused. The smell was stronger now, definitely organic decay, but where was it coming from? He swept his light across the walls, the floor, the collapsed section of roof. Nothing. Just an abandoned cabin slowly being reclaimed by the forest. And then he looked up. In the shadows of the peaked roof, in the narrow space where the intact portion of the ceiling met the walls, something was wedged. At first, Sullivan thought it was a bundle of old clothes or insulation material that had fallen from the roof. But as his light focused on it and his eyes adjusted, he realized what he was looking at. It was a backpack. Moss-colored, technical design, partially frozen, hanging from a rusty nail driven into one of the roof beams. Sullivan's hand went to his radio. "Morrison, this is Sullivan. You need to get a team up here now. I found something in the tower. He's not here, but there's gear, and it looks recent." The backpack was Marcus's. That much was confirmed within an hour when additional searchers reached the tower, and Sullivan carefully removed the pack from its perch and examined the contents. Inside was a first aid kit, a water bottle half full and frozen solid, energy bars, a headlamp, extra batteries, and a journal. The journal was a small moleskin notebook, the kind Marcus always carried to record his hiking routes and observations. The pages were damp and some of the ink had run, but most of the entries were still legible. Morrison arrived at the tower at 11:45 a.m., climbing the ladder with practiced ease despite his 63 years. He examined the backpack, photographed its position before Sullivan removed it, and then stood in the center of the cabin, slowly turning in a circle, trying to understand. "This makes no sense," he said finally. "The door was definitely locked from outside?" "Absolutely," Sullivan confirmed. "Chain and padlock, no way to secure it from inside." "And the pack was hanging up there?" "Yeah, like someone deliberately placed it up high. It wasn't fallen or tossed carelessly. It was hung on that nail." Morrison played his own flashlight across the interior. The cabin was roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, with boarded-up windows on 3 sides and the door on the 4th. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, bits of old furniture, dried leaves that had blown in through gaps in the walls. There were animal tracks in the dust, probably squirrels or mice, but no recent human footprints. The layer of dust on the floor was thick and mostly undisturbed except where Sullivan and his team had walked, except in one spot. Near the center of the cabin, in a small area about 2 feet across, the dust was disturbed in a strange circular pattern. Not swept clean, but compressed, as if something heavy had rested there for a long time and then been removed. And around this circular depression were marks that looked almost like— Morrison knelt down, examining the marks closely. They were faint but unmistakable. Footprints, boot prints, multiple impressions overlapping each other, all in the same spot, as if someone had stood there for hours, shifting weight from foot to foot, but never walking away. "Sarah," Morrison called down through the open door, "get the camera up here. I need photos of this floor pattern before anyone walks through here again." While they waited for the photographer, Morrison opened Marcus's journal. The last entry was dated January 7th, 2019, the day Marcus disappeared. The handwriting was Marcus's, neat and precise even in the difficult conditions. 11 a.m. Something wrong with GPS. Shows I'm moving but I'm stationary. Wind increasing. Visibility dropping. Going to descend to tree line and reassess. Need to get below the weather. That was it. Nothing after that. Nothing about reaching the fire tower. Nothing about being locked in. Nothing to explain why his backpack ended up hanging from a nail in an abandoned cabin while his body was nowhere to be found. Morrison called down to the team below. "We need a wider search radius. He was here, or his pack was at least. He could be anywhere within a mile of this location." The search expanded. Teams fanned out from the tower in all directions, probing snowdrifts, checking beneath fallen logs, examining any depression or opening where a person might have sought shelter. The K-9 units were brought up, a difficult trek that took hours, and set to work trying to pick up a scent trail. The helicopter made pass after pass over the forest canopy, using thermal imaging to search for any heat signature that might indicate a person alive or a body slowly warming in the January sun. They found nothing. For 3 days, the search continued. More volunteers arrived. The area around the fire tower became a focal point, with teams establishing semi-permanent camps and conducting systematic grid searches of every square foot of forest within a 2-mile radius. They found animal tracks, old fallen trees, the remnants of campfires from decades past. But no Marcus Chen. On the 4th day, the operation scaled back. The incident commander made the difficult decision that, given the time elapsed and the conditions, this was no longer a rescue operation but a recovery effort. Most of the volunteers were released. A core team of professionals would continue periodic searches, but the intensive daily operations were suspended. David Torres refused to leave. He'd been staying at the motel in Gorham, driving to the trailhead every day to receive updates, sometimes hiking partway up the trails with search teams, desperately hoping to be the one to find Marcus. On the evening of January 12th, when Morrison told him about the decision to scale back, David stood in the parking lot under the stars and felt something inside him break. "You're giving up," he said, his voice hollow. "We're not giving up," Morrison replied gently. "We're being realistic about resources. We've searched an area of over 50 square miles. We've found his pack but no other trace. The weather is getting worse again. Another storm system moving in tomorrow. We can't keep 30 people in the field indefinitely." "So what? You just wait for spring? Wait for the snow to melt and see if his body turns up?" Morrison had no answer to that, because the truth was, yes, that was exactly what would likely happen. Many people who disappeared in winter in the White Mountains weren't found until the snow melted. Sometimes not until summer hikers stumbled upon remains in remote gullies or dense forest groves. The mountains kept their secrets until they decided to reveal them. Marcus's parents left New Hampshire on January 14th. There was nothing more they could do. Chen held her husband's arm as they walked to their rental car, moving like people who had aged 10 years in a single week. Before they left, Lynn asked Morrison one question: "Will you find him?" Morrison wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise that they would bring Marcus home, that they would give him a proper burial, that they would provide answers. But he'd been doing this work too long to make promises he couldn't keep. "We'll keep looking," he said. "I promise you that." The investigation into Marcus's last movements continued even after the active search ended. Tech analysts examined his GPS data, trying to make sense of the impossible jump from the trail to the tower location. They found anomalies in the satellite signal data, gaps that suggested either equipment malfunction or some kind of interference. One analyst noted that the pattern looked similar to what happens during solar storms, but there had been no solar activity on January 7th. Marcus's cell phone records showed his device had briefly connected to a tower at 10:12 a.m., just minutes before the GPS data showed him jumping to the tower location. But no calls were made, no texts sent, just a momentary ping as the phone searched for signal. His Garmin watch was recovered from his backpack. The device was still functional, though the battery was dead. When they charged it and downloaded the data, they found something disturbing. The watch had continued recording his heart rate until 11:23 a.m., 18 minutes after his GPS location stopped moving, and his heart rate during those final 18 minutes had been elevated. Not panicked, not the racing pulse of someone in mortal fear, but elevated. Between 105 and 118 beats per minute, the heart rate of someone walking quickly or climbing, the heart rate of someone still alive and moving. But where had he been moving? Inside the cabin? The space was only 10 feet across. You couldn't walk for 18 minutes without repeatedly crossing the same small area. And if he'd been inside, why hadn't he responded when search teams arrived? Why hadn't he called for help? Why hadn't he activated his emergency beacon? At 11:23 a.m., according to the watch data, his heart rate had stopped. 0 beats per minute. Either the watch had malfunctioned or Marcus Chen's heart had stopped beating. The medical examiner's office consulted on the data. Without a body, they couldn't determine cause of death, but the pattern suggested hypothermia. The gradual slowing of heart rate, the elevated baseline from shivering thermogenesis, then the sudden cessation. It was consistent, but it still didn't explain where he'd been or what had happened. January gave way to February. Snow continued to fall on the White Mountains. The fire tower remained standing in its hidden grove of spruce. The chain cut, but the door left open in case Marcus somehow, impossibly, made his way back there. Search teams returned periodically on clear days, checking the tower, expanding their search grids, but finding nothing. The story faded from the news. Other emergencies, other tragedies demanded public attention. Marcus Chen became another name in the long list of people who had disappeared in the White Mountains. His case file remained open. His photos remained on missing person databases. His family waited, and in the forest, something waited too. Something that wouldn't be found until May, when the snow finally melted and 2 hikers decided to explore an old trail that wasn't on their map anymore. Something that would raise more questions than it answered and turn Marcus Chen's disappearance from a tragic accident into something far more disturbing. But that was still months away. For now, in the frozen heart of winter, Marcus Chen remained lost. His body absent, his fate unknown, his last moments a mystery written in GPS coordinates and heart rate data that made no sense to anyone who studied them. The mountains kept their secret. The forest held its silence. And somewhere, impossibly, Marcus Chen stood waiting to be found. Winter loosened its grip on the White Mountains slowly. reluctantly. February remained frozen. March brought alternating cycles of thaw and refreeze that made trail conditions treacherous, and April arrived with rain that turned snow into slush and trails into streams. But by early May, the high elevations had finally shed their snow cover, and the presidential range emerged into spring like a hibernating animal waking from a long sleep. On May 11th, 2019, two hikers from Maine decided to explore an area of the White Mountains they'd never visited before. Ethan Walsh and Jennifer Cormier were in their late 20s, both experienced hikers who'd completed all 48 4,000-footers and were now seeking out more obscure destinations. Ethan had found a reference in an old hiking guide from the 1970s to a fire lookout tower somewhere between Madison and Adams, marked on old maps but no longer mentioned in contemporary trail guides. They'd decided to make finding it their adventure for the day. "It's like geocaching but old school," Ethan had said when pitching the idea to Jennifer. Following old maps to find abandoned structures. Plus, the views from those old towers were always spectacular. They'd started early, parking at Appalachia Trailhead, the same parking lot where Marcus Chen's car had sat buried in snow 4 months earlier. They'd hiked up Valley Way for about 2 miles, then left the established trail and headed northeast, following coordinates Ethan had extrapolated from studying old USGS topographic maps. They had GPS devices, compass, paper maps, and a printout of historical fire tower locations in New Hampshire. They were prepared for a day of bushwhacking through dense forest. By 10:30 a.m., they'd been off trail for nearly 2 hours, pushing through thick spruce forest and navigating around deadfall and steep ravines. The forest at this elevation was primeval, old-growth trees that had stood for centuries, their branches creating a canopy so dense that little sunlight reached the forest floor. The ground was soft, with decades of accumulated needles and moss. Everything smelled of damp earth and decay and new growth. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Jennifer asked, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "We've been walking in circles for like 20 minutes. Ethan checked his GPS. According to this, the tower should be about 200 yards northeast. But I'll admit, it's hard to tell with all these trees. Everything looks the same." They kept going, and 10 minutes later Jennifer stopped abruptly. "There, look." Through the trees ahead, barely visible in the dappled sunlight, was a structure. Straight lines where nature provided only curves, the unmistakable geometry of human construction. They approached carefully, excitement building. The tower was still standing, though clearly abandoned. The wooden frame was weathered gray, and the cabin at the top leaned precariously. But it was intact, recognizable, a genuine piece of White Mountains history hidden away in the forest. "This is amazing," Ethan said, pulling out his camera. "I can't believe more people don't know about this place." Jennifer walked around the base of the tower, examining the support structure. That's when she noticed something odd. At the base of the ladder leading up to the cabin, there was a section of the wooden beam that looked different from the others. Cleaner, less weathered, as if it had been touched or handled recently. "Ethan, look at this." He came over, and they both stared at the beam. There were marks on it, scrapes in the wood that exposed lighter material beneath the gray patina. The kind of marks that boots would make if someone had been climbing up and down repeatedly. "Hikers must still come out here sometimes," Ethan said, "even though it's not on the maps anymore." Jennifer looked up at the cabin. "Should we climb up? Is it safe?" Ethan tested the first few rungs of the ladder, putting his weight on them cautiously. They held. "Seems solid enough. Let's check it out." He climbed first, Jennifer following. The ladder rungs were spaced far apart, and several of them were rotted or missing entirely, forcing them to skip rungs and stretch for the next secure foothold. When they reached the top, Ethan pushed open the door. The chain was gone, though a rusted padlock still hung from a nail on the wall, and stepped into the cabin. The smell hit both of them immediately. It was strong now, far stronger than it had been when Jake Sullivan had opened this door 4 months earlier. The warming temperatures of spring had accelerated decomposition processes that winter had held in suspended animation. The smell was unmistakable, overwhelming, the smell of death. "Oh, God," Jennifer said, covering her nose with her sleeve. "There's something dead in here." Ethan pulled out a flashlight, though the broken windows provided enough light to see clearly. The cabin was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet, with debris scattered across the floor. Broken glass, old boards, what looked like the remnants of furniture that had rotted away decades ago. But standing in the center of the room, absolutely motionless, was a figure. For one horrible moment, Ethan's mind couldn't process it. It looked like a person, a man in dark clothing, standing upright, facing the wall opposite the door. But the stillness was wrong. No breathing, no movement, not even the slight sway that living bodies make when standing still. And the skin visible on the back of his neck was gray, leathery, partially mummified. "Jesus Christ," Ethan whispered. "Jennifer, don't come up. Go back down right now." But Jennifer had already stepped through the doorway. She saw the figure and screamed, a short, sharp sound that echoed in the small space. Then she turned and scrambled back down the ladder so fast she nearly fell. Ethan stood frozen, his flashlight beam fixed on the figure. It was a person. A dead person. But how was it standing? How could a body remain upright like this? He'd expected, if they found anything, to see remains on the floor or slumped against a wall. But this man was standing as if he'd simply stopped mid-stride months ago and never moved again. His clothing was weathered but recognizable. Dark pants, what looked like layers of outdoor gear, heavy boots. His hair was matted, his skin desiccated by months of freezing temperatures that had essentially freeze-dried the body. His hands hung at his sides, slightly curved as if he'd been holding something. And most disturbing of all, his eyes were open, dried to the consistency of leather, staring at the wall in front of him. Ethan forced himself to move closer, though every instinct screamed at him to run. He needed to see if there was any identification, anything that would tell him who this person was. As he approached, he noticed details that made his stomach turn. The man's feet weren't flat on the ground. He was slightly tilted forward, as if he'd been in the process of taking a step. The position suggested he'd been frozen solid while standing, and had remained in that position as his body slowly mummified through the winter months. On the man's wrist was a watch. On his jacket, partially visible, was a name embroidered on a patch. Sheen. Ethan backed out of the cabin carefully, descended the ladder on shaking legs, and found Jennifer sitting on the ground at the base of the tower, pale and trembling. "We need to call 911, he said. "There's a body up there, I think it's that hiker who went missing in January." Jennifer stared at him. "The one they searched for? Marcus something?" "Yeah, Marcus Chen. I think that's him up there. But how is he standing?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. I don't understand any of this." They hiked back to the trailhead as quickly as possible, neither of them speaking much, both of them trying to process what they'd seen. When they reached cell phone coverage, Ethan called 911 and reported their discovery. The dispatcher asked him to repeat the information twice, as if she couldn't quite believe what he was saying. By 2 p.m., the first responders had arrived at the tower. By 3 p.m., Brad Morrison was there, climbing the ladder with a knot in his stomach, dreading what he would find, but knowing he needed to see it for himself. When he stepped into the cabin and saw Marcus Chen standing there, frozen in time, he understood why Ethan's voice had sounded so shaken on the 911 call. It wasn't natural. Bodies didn't do this. When people died, they fell. They collapsed. They didn't remain standing like statues. Morrison approached carefully, documenting everything with his camera. He could see now that Marcus wasn't exactly standing. He was slightly tilted, balanced in a position that shouldn't have been stable. It was as if he'd been frozen solid while standing, and then, as the body lost flexibility through decomposition, he'd remained in that position, essentially mummified in place. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Novak, arrived at the tower at 4:30 p.m. She climbed the ladder with some difficulty. She was in her early 50s and not accustomed to off-trail hiking, but when she saw Marcus Chen's body, her professional detachment slipped for just a moment. "I've been doing this for 23 years, she said quietly. "I've never seen anything like this." The recovery operation took hours. The body had to be carefully lowered from the cabin in a specialized rescue litter, a delicate process made more difficult by rigor mortis that had set in months ago and never fully released due to the freezing temperatures. Marcus Chen's body was rigid, frozen in his standing position, and had to be transported that way because attempting to bend or reposition the limbs might cause them to break. By the time they got him down to the forest floor and secured in the transport litter, it was nearly dark. A team of 6 rescuers carried him out through the forest, using headlamps to navigate, arriving at the trailhead after 10 p.m. An ambulance was waiting, though there was no rush anymore. Marcus Chen had been dead for 4 months. That night, in the medical examiner's facility in Concord, Dr. Novak began her preliminary examination. The body would need to thaw before a full autopsy could be performed, but even the external examination revealed puzzling details. Marcus's clothing was intact and showed no signs of trauma. No tears, no bloodstains, no indication that he'd been attacked by an animal or another person. His face, though mummified, showed no expression of pain or fear. His hands showed no defensive wounds. His boots were still laced and tied properly. The temperature of decomposition suggested he'd died sometime in January, likely within days of his disappearance. But the position of the body suggested something else, something that Dr. Novak struggled to explain in her initial notes. "Subject was found in standing position," she wrote. "No support structures nearby that would explain how body remained upright. Preliminary assessment suggests death occurred while subject was standing, and cold temperatures caused rapid freezing of body in that position. However, this does not explain how body remained balanced. Standing position requires constant micro-adjustments by living muscles. Once death occurs, body should collapse. No explanation for why subject's body did not fall." The investigation into how Marcus had died began immediately. Fish and Game officers, working with state police investigators, returned to the fire tower the next day to process it as a potential crime scene. They found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, no weapons, no indication that anyone else had been there. They found Marcus's personal locator beacon in his jacket pocket, unactivated. They found his emergency whistle attached to his pack strap, unused. They found his lighter, fire-starting kit, emergency bivvy, all the survival gear he'd been carrying. None of it deployed, none of it used. On the floor of the cabin, investigators found a strange circular pattern that Brad Morrison had noticed months earlier, the depression in the dust where something heavy had rested. Now that they knew Marcus had been standing there, the pattern made sense. It was where his feet had been, shifting slightly back and forth over hours or days, grinding down the dust in that small area. But the pattern was too clean. If Marcus had been standing there dying of hypothermia or injury, there should have been other marks. Signs that he'd moved around the cabin, tried to signal for help, attempted to break out through the boarded windows. Instead, there were only those 2 footprints in the center of the room, as if he'd walked to that exact spot and simply stopped moving. The forensic team found one more puzzling detail. On the wall Marcus had been facing, about 5 feet up from the floor, there were scratches in the old wood. They were faint, barely visible, but when examined closely they formed letters. Someone had carved words into the wall with something sharp, maybe a knife blade or a piece of broken glass. The words said, "I can't move." The letters were shaky, as if carved by someone whose hands were numb with cold or trembling with fear. The C was especially rough, the lines wavering. But the message was clear enough. I can't move. Investigators photographed the scratches, measured them, analyzed the depth and angle of the marks. The carving was fresh, or at least not decades old like most of the graffiti in the cabin. Someone had carved this recently, probably Marcus. But what did it mean? Why couldn't he move? Was he paralyzed by injury? Immobilized by hypothermia? Or was something else keeping him standing in place? Something that forced him to carve a desperate message on the wall while his body slowly froze, and his heart rate, recorded by his watch, gradually declined toward 0. The full autopsy was performed 3 days later, after Marcus's body had been allowed to thaw enough for internal examination. Dr. Novak worked methodically, documenting every detail, taking tissue samples, examining organs, searching for any clue that would explain his death. Her findings were both conclusive and completely unsatisfying. Cause of death, hypothermia. Marcus Chen had frozen to death, exactly as the initial data had suggested. His core body temperature had dropped low enough to stop his heart. The internal signs were all consistent: ice crystal formation in tissues, frostbite damage to extremities, the metabolic changes that accompany severe cold exposure. But there were no other injuries. No head trauma that might have caused paralysis. No broken bones that would have immobilized him. No signs of stroke or heart attack or any medical emergency that would explain why he'd been unable to move, unable to activate his rescue beacon, unable to save himself. His blood work showed no drugs, no alcohol, no toxins. His brain tissue showed no obvious pathology, though decomposition made detailed analysis difficult. By every measurable standard, Marcus Chen had been healthy until the cold killed him. So, what happened? The lead investigator asked when Dr. Novak presented her findings. Why did he just stand there and freeze? Why didn't he move, try to get warm, call for help? Dr. Novak had no answer. She could tell them how Marcus had died. She couldn't tell them why. The investigation continued through May and into June. Detectives interviewed everyone who'd been in the White Mountains on January 7th. They checked Marcus's phone records, his email, his social media, looking for any indication that he'd been planning something, that his death might have been intentional. They found nothing suspicious. Marcus had been looking forward to things: a climbing trip to Alaska in July, a friend's wedding in August, a work project launching in the fall. He had no reason to want to die. The theory that eventually emerged was this: Marcus had somehow gotten disoriented in the storm, wandered off trail, and found his way to the fire tower seeking shelter. He'd discovered the door locked from outside, but there was a gap in the boards of one wall. Investigators found it during their examination, that was wide enough for a desperate person to squeeze through. Once inside, he'd tried to wait out the storm, but the cabin provided little actual shelter. The broken windows let in wind and snow. The temperature inside was barely different from outside. As the hypothermia set in, Marcus would have experienced confusion, poor decision-making, and eventually paradoxical undressing, the phenomenon where freezing people feel overheated and remove their clothes. Except Marcus hadn't undressed. His clothes were all still on, properly layered, zipped, and buttoned. The theory couldn't explain the standing position. It couldn't explain why he hadn't activated his beacon. It couldn't explain the scratched message on the wall. "I can't move." By July, the official investigation concluded. The report listed Marcus Chen's death as accidental, caused by hypothermia while sheltering in an abandoned structure during a severe winter storm. The case was closed, but Brad Morrison, who'd coordinated the search, who'd been the first to see the GPS data that didn't make sense, who'd stood in that cabin and felt something was wrong, didn't believe it. In his own notes, filed away in his personal records, he wrote, "Something happened to Marcus Chen that we don't understand. The evidence doesn't fit any scenario that makes sense. A healthy, experienced mountaineer doesn't freeze to death without fighting to survive. A person doesn't stand in one spot for hours while hypothermia kills them, and a body doesn't remain standing after death without some kind of support. The tower should be sealed permanently. No one else should go there." But the tower wasn't sealed. It remained standing in its hidden grove of spruce, accessible to anyone determined enough to find it. And as summer gave way to fall and fall to winter again, occasional hikers would make the trek to see the place where Marcus Chen had died. Some of them reported strange experiences, feeling watched, hearing footsteps that had no source, seeing movement in their peripheral vision that disappeared when they looked directly. One hiker, visiting in October 2019, took a photo inside the cabin. When he reviewed the image later, he claimed there was a shadow in the center of the room, roughly human-shaped, standing in the exact spot where Marcus had been found. The photo was widely shared on hiking forums and paranormal websites, though skeptics dismissed it as a trick of light or digital artifact. Marcus's family held a memorial service in Boston in late July. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered on a mountain in the Cascades, one of his favorite ranges, far from the White Mountains where he died. David Torres gave a eulogy that focused on Marcus's love of the wilderness and his careful, methodical approach to challenges. "He always had a plan," David said. "He always knew what he was doing. What happened to him doesn't make sense to me, it never will. But I choose to remember him as he was, confident, capable, and in love with the mountains, even if the mountains didn't love him back." The case file remained in the New Hampshire Fish and Game archives. Periodically, someone would pull it out and review it, looking for something that previous investigators might have missed. But the conclusion never changed. Marcus Chen had died of hypothermia in an abandoned fire tower. How he got there, why he couldn't leave, what kept him standing, those questions had no answers. The forest kept its secrets. And somewhere in that forest, in a small wooden cabin that leaned precariously but refused to fall, those secrets remained. Waiting, perhaps, for someone else to find them. Waiting for the next person who would follow GPS coordinates to a place they shouldn't be, who would climb a ladder they shouldn't climb, who would step into a room where the air itself felt wrong and discover that some mysteries don't want to be solved. They just want company. The official file on Marcus Chen's death was 6 inches thick by the time it was archived in September 2019. Incident reports, search logs, autopsy findings, witness statements, GPS data analysis, weather reports, photographs. Hundreds of pages documenting every aspect of the investigation. And in the final summary, written by the lead investigator, a single line stood out: cause of death, hypothermia. Circumstances, unexplained. unexplained. It was an admission of defeat, a recognition that despite all the evidence collected, despite all the expertise applied to analyzing that evidence, the fundamental questions about what happened to Marcus Chen that day remained unanswered. The file went into storage, and officially the case was closed. But Marcus Chen's story didn't end with his death. In some ways, it was only beginning. The first person to return to the fire tower after the official investigation concluded was a journalist named Rebecca Hayes. She'd been following the case since May, when Marcus's body was discovered, and she was convinced there was more to the story than the official report suggested. In October 2019, she hiked to the tower with a photographer and spent several hours documenting the scene and taking detailed notes. "The place feels wrong," she wrote in an article published in New Hampshire magazine. "I'm not someone who believes in ghosts or supernatural explanations, but I can't deny that standing in that cabin provokes a visceral sense of unease. The air feels heavy. The silence feels deliberate, as if the forest is holding its breath. And in the center of the room, where Marcus Chen died, there's a cold spot that defies rational explanation. Even on a warm October afternoon, that spot is several degrees colder than the rest of the cabin." Her article reignited public interest in the case. Hikers began making pilgrimages to the tower, some out of morbid curiosity, others searching for answers, still others hoping to experience the strangeness that multiple visitors had reported. A Facebook group formed dedicated to the Marcus Chen mystery, where members shared theories, debated evidence, and organized group hikes to the tower. Some of the theories were grounded in science and rational explanation. One popular hypothesis suggested that Marcus had suffered a sudden medical emergency, a stroke or seizure, that had paralyzed him moments after he entered the cabin. The message scratched into the wall, "I can't move," supported this theory. Perhaps he'd been conscious but paralyzed, aware of what was happening but unable to activate his rescue beacon or take any action to save himself. But the medical examiner had found no evidence of stroke. No blood clots, no hemorrhaging, no signs of neurological damage that would cause sudden paralysis. And even if he had suffered a stroke, the human body doesn't remain standing. Paralyzed people collapse. They fall. They don't freeze upright in the center of a room. Other theories veered into the paranormal. The White Mountains, some researchers noted, had a long history of strange occurrences. Native American tribes had considered certain areas sacred or cursed. There were old stories of travelers who had vanished without trace, of voices heard calling from empty forests, of lights seen moving through the trees where no lights should be. A paranormal investigator named Thomas Brennan visited the tower in November 2019 with an array of electronic equipment, EMF detectors, thermal cameras, audio recorders. He spent 2 nights in the cabin documenting his experience. His findings, posted to his YouTube channel, claimed to show significant electromagnetic anomalies in the center of the room, temperature fluctuations that his equipment couldn't explain, and audio recordings with what he described as whispers in the silence. Skeptics immediately dismissed his evidence as equipment malfunction or wishful interpretation of random noise. But Brennan's videos got over 2 million views, and his description of feeling paralyzed with fear while standing in the spot where Marcus died echoed experiences others had reported. "I felt like I couldn't move," Brennan said in one video. "Not that I was scared to move, but like my body wouldn't respond to my brain's commands. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it was the most terrifying 10 seconds of my life. I understood in that moment what Marcus might have felt." The comparison between Brennan's temporary paralysis and Marcus's permanent one sparked new speculation. Had Marcus experienced the same phenomenon but been unable to break free? Had he stood in that spot, trying to move, trying to call for help, but finding his body unresponsive? The scratched message suggested he'd retained at least some motor control, enough to carve the words into the wall, but perhaps not enough to walk, to reach his beacon, to save himself. Dr. Patricia Novak, the medical examiner, was asked about this theory in an interview with a local news station. She chose her words carefully. "Psychogenic paralysis is a real phenomenon," she said. "Extreme psychological stress can cause temporary loss of motor function. However, such paralysis is typically short-lived, lasting minutes at most, not the hours or days that would have been required for Marcus to freeze to death. Additionally, psychogenic paralysis doesn't explain the physical position of the body after death. There's no medical precedent for a body remaining upright without some kind of external support." But she also admitted something else. "There are aspects of this case that I can't explain with conventional medical knowledge. That doesn't mean there isn't an explanation, only that I don't have it." As winter approached and the first anniversary of Marcus's disappearance neared, his family released a statement asking people to stop visiting the tower. The pilgrimages had become disrespectful, they said. Their son's death wasn't a tourist attraction. It wasn't a mystery to be solved by amateur detectives and ghost hunters. It was a tragedy, and they wanted it to be allowed to rest. "Marcus loved the mountains," his mother wrote, "but he wouldn't want his death to become a spectacle. We've accepted that we'll never fully understand what happened to him. We've made our peace with the mystery. We ask that others do the same." The statement was widely shared, and for a time, visits to the tower decreased, but they never stopped entirely. The pull of an unsolved mystery is too strong for some people to resist. David Torres visited the tower only once, in early December 2019. He went alone, didn't tell anyone he was going, and spent less than 10 minutes inside the cabin. He didn't bring cameras or recording equipment. He simply stood in the space where his friend had died and tried to understand. Later, he would tell a reporter, "I felt him there. I know how that sounds. I know it's probably just my brain trying to process grief in some way that makes sense, but I swear I felt Marcus in that cabin. Not like a ghost, not like something supernatural, just his presence, his confusion, his fear, and something else. Something that felt like warning, like he was trying to tell me to leave, to get out before whatever happened to him could happen to me." David left and never went back. He moved from Boston to Seattle a few months later, closer to Marcus's parents, helping them cope with their loss. He stopped following the online discussions about the case, stopped reading the theories and speculation. For him, Marcus's death needed to be a private grief, not a public puzzle. But the puzzle continued to attract attention. In spring 2020, a team of researchers from MIT approached the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department with a proposal. They wanted to conduct a detailed scientific study of the tower and the surrounding area, measuring magnetic fields, radiation levels, geological characteristics, anything that might explain the strange reports people had made about the location. The proposal was denied. The official reason given was that the tower was unsafe, and the department didn't want to be liable for any accidents. The unofficial reason, shared by one staff member who spoke on condition of anonymity, was simpler. "There's something wrong with that place. We don't fully understand what it is, and we don't want to encourage more people to go there looking for answers. Some mysteries are better left alone." Brad Morrison retired from the AMC in June 2020. In his final weeks, he organized a small, unofficial ceremony at the Appalachia Trailhead. A dozen people attended: search and rescue volunteers, conservation officers, a few hikers who had known Marcus. They placed a small stone marker near the trail register, engraved with simple words, In memory of Marcus Chen, 1984 to 2019. Experienced mountaineer, careful planner, kind friend. The mountains remember. At the ceremony, Morrison spoke briefly about the search, about finding Marcus, about the questions that remained. "We did everything we could," he said. "We searched for weeks. We found him eventually. But we couldn't bring back the Marcus we were looking for, the living, breathing person who'd started up this trail one January morning. We could only bring back his body and the mystery of what happened to him. That's something I'll carry for the rest of my life." The stone marker remains at the trailhead. Hikers passing by sometimes stop to read it, to wonder about the story behind it. A few make the trek to find the tower, though the route is unmarked and difficult. Most simply continue on their way, completing their planned hikes, returning safely to their cars, driving home to their normal lives. But occasionally, someone doesn't return. Not often. The White Mountains claim lives every year, and most disappearances have clear explanations: falls from cliffs, exposure to weather, medical emergencies. But occasionally, there's one that doesn't make sense. One where an experienced hiker simply vanishes, where search teams find nothing, where GPS data shows impossible movements or stops transmitting without explanation. And when those cases occur, someone always mentions Marcus Chen. Someone always says, "Remember that guy who froze standing up in the fire tower?" Someone always wonders if there's a connection, a pattern, something in these mountains that occasionally reaches out and takes people in ways that defy explanation. In August 2021, a solo hiker reported a strange experience near the tower. She'd been searching for the structure, following GPS coordinates, when she became disoriented. Her compass started spinning erratically. Her GPS showed her location jumping around randomly. She felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread and an equally sudden inability to move her legs. She described it as, "like my feet were glued to the ground." After what she estimated was 3 or 4 minutes, though she wasn't sure because time felt distorted, the paralysis released. Her equipment started working normally, and she ran back toward the established trails without looking back. Her story was posted on a hiking forum and quickly drew responses from others who claimed similar experiences. A few reported temporary paralysis. Others described equipment malfunctions near the tower. One person claimed to have seen a figure standing in the cabin window, silhouetted against the broken glass, perfectly still, before realizing the cabin was empty when he climbed up to investigate. Skeptics pointed out that these reports were likely influenced by knowledge of Marcus Chen's case. People expected strange things to happen near the tower, so they interpreted normal experiences, momentary disorientation, equipment glitches, natural shadows, as something mysterious. The power of suggestion was strong, and the human brain was very good at finding patterns even where none existed. But Brad Morrison, now retired and no longer bound by official caution, offered a different perspective in an email to one of the researchers studying the case. "I've been working in these mountains for 30 years. I've seen people die in falls and storms and avalanches. I've seen people make stupid decisions and pay for them. I've seen bad luck and good luck and everything in between. Marcus Chen's case is different. I can't explain how exactly. The evidence doesn't point to anything specific, but there's a quality to it. To the way he died, to the place where he died, to the reports from people who visited that tower, that feels fundamentally wrong. Not supernatural necessarily, just wrong. Like there's something about that location that we don't understand, that our instruments can't measure, that our science can't explain. Maybe it's geology, maybe it's magnetism, maybe it's something about human perception and how it can malfunction under certain conditions. I don't know. What I do know is that Marcus Chen didn't just freeze to death. Something else happened to him, and until we understand what, that tower should be avoided. The New Hampshire Forest Service has considered dismantling the tower several times. Each time, the proposal has been delayed by budget constraints, bureaucratic complications, or simple inertia. The structure remains standing, slowly decaying, gradually being reclaimed by the forest. In winter, snow covers it almost completely, making it invisible from any distance. In spring and summer, it emerges again, its weathered wood barely distinguishable from the dead trees around it. And in that cabin, in the center of the floor, there's still a spot where the dust won't settle, where the temperature drops a few degrees below the surrounding air, where hikers who are brave enough or foolish enough to stand there report a sensation like standing in a doorway, caught between two spaces, unable to move forward or back. The scratched message on the wall has faded slightly, worn by humidity and time, but it's still legible if you know where to look. I can't move 3 words that encapsulate an entire mystery. 3 words that might be a medical description, a psychological state, or a warning. 3 words carved by a man who knew he was dying, but couldn't explain why he was unable to save himself. Marcus Chen's GPS watch was returned to his family after the investigation concluded. His parents gave it to David, who kept it in a drawer for months before finally looking at the data one more time. He scrolled through the tracking information, following Marcus's route up the mountain, watching the timeline of that last day unfold in GPS coordinates and elevation markers. He found something no one had mentioned in the official reports. At 11:05 a.m., when Marcus's location jumped from the trail to the tower location, there was a brief note automatically generated by the watch's software. Satellite error, position unreliable, manual correction required. The watch had known the data was wrong. It had flagged it as an error, but the position hadn't been manually corrected because Marcus hadn't corrected it. Because by then, Marcus was already at the tower, already unable to move, already beginning the slow process of freezing to death while standing upright in a place he should never have been able to reach. David closed the watch data and never looked at it again. Some questions, he decided, didn't need answers. Some mysteries were better left as mysteries. Marcus was gone. No amount of analysis or investigation would bring him back. But late at night, when David couldn't sleep, he sometimes thought about those last minutes of Marcus's life. The GPS showing impossible movements. The heart rate elevated like he was walking or climbing even though he was trapped in a locked cabin. The scratched message on the wall. The position of the body, standing as if frozen mid-step. And he wondered, what if Marcus hadn't been alone in that cabin? What if something else had been there with him? Something that kept him standing, that prevented him from moving, that watched as hypothermia slowly shut down his body while he remained conscious and aware and unable to cry for help? It was an irrational thought. David knew that. There was no evidence of anyone or anything else in the cabin. But the thought persisted, growing stronger in the dark hours before dawn when rational explanations felt thin and inadequate. In the White Mountains, winter came again. Snow fell on the Presidential Range, covering trails and peaks and the hidden fire tower where Marcus Chen had spent his last hours. The forest grew silent except for wind and the occasional crack of ice-laden branches. And in that silence, the tower stood as it had stood for decades, leaning slightly but refusing to fall, keeping its secrets, waiting. Occasionally, a hiker might glimpse it through the trees, a suggestion of straight lines where nature provided only curves. Most would note it and move on, but a few, drawn by curiosity or some deeper compulsion, would leave the marked trails and fight through dense forest to reach it. They would climb the ladder, push open the door, and step into the small cabin where the air felt heavy, and the cold spot in the center of the floor defied all attempts at explanation. And sometimes, just sometimes, one of them would report the same sensation that others had described: a momentary inability to move, a feeling of being held in place, of standing in a doorway that led somewhere they couldn't see and didn't want to go. The sensation would pass. They would leave. They would tell themselves it was just fear, just imagination, just the power of suggestion working on a mind that knew what had happened there. But they would remember. They would wonder. And late at night, in the safety of their homes, far from the mountains, they would ask themselves the same question that everyone who knew Marcus Chen's story eventually asked: what really happened in that tower? The answer, if it exists, remains locked in the silence of the forest, carved into weathered wood, frozen in GPS data that makes no sense, and standing in the memory of a man who died on his feet with his eyes open, unable to move, unable to call for help, unable to explain what had taken hold of him, and refused to let go until the cold had finished its work. Some trails, it seems, lead to places from which there is no return. Not because the path is lost, but because something at the end of the path is waiting, watching, holding on. Marcus Chen found such a trail, and in finding it, he became part of the mystery he'd walked into. A warning, perhaps, or a question, or simply a reminder that the wilderness holds more than beauty and challenge. It holds secrets. And sometimes those secrets hold you back.